Okay, so I'll very briefly introduce myself and then introduce each of our speakers and the topic of this breakout session. I hope as delegates you got a good bit of information from this morning so far, from the keynote and the plenary. And obviously you can't be in all breakouts at once, so do use the opportunity to go back to those recordings and catch any others that you couldn't make. But thanks for joining this one, and hopefully you've got a particular interest in the topic of tenant voice and employment support. So I'm going to chair it. I'm Lindsey Sweeney, the Managing Director of Communities That Work, and I'm really pleased to see on the panel some colleagues I know and some new colleagues that I'm looking forward to hearing from. The topic for this breakout session came through really considering very clearly the direction of the social housing white paper, the Tenants Charter, and some of the work that we at Communities That Work are on the margins of, really, with DLUC, the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, on all of the work they want to do in implementing the levelling up, the social housing white paper and the Tenants Charter. And it got us thinking about the role of social housing tenants and residents in the work we do in housing and employment and in opportunity. So this session is going to look at how best to bring tenant voice and satisfaction measures into our services in general as social housing providers, but also, of course, particularly for this conference, looking at services for working age tenants and residents who might need some help and support to understand or improve employment skills, training opportunities, earning opportunities and progression in work, etc. All the gamut of things that all of us need to get into work and sustain work and have a good quality work experience. So that was the background thinking for this session. And it feels very pertinent at the moment. We know that the department is very keen to make good on its pledges to understand tenant voice and put social housing tenants at the heart of its work, and we as housing providers must have social tenants at the heart of our work too. So I'm really keen to understand the perspectives of all of our speakers, and also to understand how that tenant voice can change and impact the work that we do in housing and employment support services. So that's me, and what I'll do is in turn introduce each of our speakers, so it won't be a big memory test for who you're hearing from in order. None of our speakers are using slides, which I think is great, so we'll have a bit more of a conversational presentation. And we're going to run in the following order, so we'll hear from Jenny first, and then Lynn, and then Stephen. So very briefly, Jenny Osborne is Chief Executive of TPAS. Lynn Brosnan is Tenant Advisory Panel Member at the National Housing Federation, and Stephen Ward is Social Housing White Paper Implementation Programme Lead at DLUC. So those are their titles, and I'll give a more of an introduction to each of our speakers just ahead of them opening the floor. So without further ado, over to Jenny. Jenny I have known and work on a number of panels with, including one at DLUC on the social housing white paper implementation. So really delighted to have TPAS here, and Jenny's first-rate chief executive at TPAS and has really advanced the work they do. So I'm always impressed to hear from Jenny. Looking back over some of the many roles and experience she's had, she was head of corporate services with responsibility for membership and governance at TPAS now. She's an English graduate from Leeds University. She sits on the board at Stockport Homes, who I'm pleased to say are a member of Communities That Work, and is also on the board of the National Federation of ALMOs. Those other social housing providers who I'm very pleased to say we also work with really closely on the Housing and Employment Task Force. So there's lots of areas in which we coalesce. I know for a fact that Jenny's passionate about the tenant engagement agenda. She's a really clear voice and a strong advocate for good partnership working between tenants and housing providers and contractors and government, and weaves together that picture really well. So I'm very much looking forward to Jenny's perspective on this. And Jenny, without further ado, over to you. And delegates, please do place your questions in Slido. We'll get to them all at the end.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thank you for that introduction. Lovely to be here today and part of this session. So, yeah, very briefly, I've just been asked to comment, just make a few opening comments, really, and I will keep it brief. Just for those people that perhaps haven't heard of TPAS, we are the tenant engagement organisation working across England. We're a membership organisation of landlords and tenants together. So we're not the tenant voice in any way, shape or form. I'm always clear that we make that clear at anything I speak at. We've got 280 different landlord members across the sector, commercial partners, such, you know, people that work in sort of repairing our homes, as well as tenant groups of all types across the country. And kind of the notes I got for today, one of the sort of the words was your view on the emergence of tenants' view in the last few years and where we are now. And I suppose I'd sort of say it's maybe not the word emergence, but it's the respect given to tenants' voice now, because tenants have always had a voice, haven't they? They always have. And for someone like me, who Lindsay's quite clearly pointed out, has been in tenant engagement a long time, I have seen it ebb and flow many times over the last few years. I suppose the first thing I'd say, and I've said it many times, is I really hope this white paper is the point of which that ebb and flow stops, and we actually set this as the trajectory for the future and absolutely get it embedded in our organisations for the long term. That's the hope, isn't it, for me, out of the white paper, stop that ebb and flow. Of course, we absolutely welcome the white paper. No two ways about it. It's brought forward many of the things I could hear from those round tables that were held with the ministers a few years ago, and certainly what Grenfell United and others have been calling for. Absolutely brilliant to see that. The proactive consumer regulation in particular is going to be incredibly helpful in making sure tenants' voice is respected and heard. And a lot of the words in the white paper are things we've all been calling for a while, around accountability, transparency. But we've still got a trust issue that is going to be fundamental still for many years to come, and is fundamental to where tenants may want to get involved in employment support, and the kind of the topic that we're more discussing today. That trust issue has got to be forefront of our minds, because I think there's obviously a lot going on at the moment with the Ombudsman's pushing on with great stuff. The regulator is. We've got the tenant satisfaction measures at the moment out for consultation, which are great, and we've got comments, all of us, I'm sure, on those. But I still think we've got to keep looking and saying, let's take a step back and keep looking at the bigger picture that we've got going on here. And if we look at what's happening in the media at the moment, we can still see we've got a real fundamental problem with some of our relationships with our tenants, and certainly how we've treated tenants in the past, and in some cases how we're still treating them today in terms of listening to their views and acting on them. So we've got a massive issue to do in landing still in the sense that tenants matter. And we've still got a big issue around stigma. But I do think employment support can play a real part in that. But we also need to be clear about the dangers it can bring as well in adding to stigma. I'm sure we might pick that up later in a longer debate. I think we've seen loads of stuff over the years at TPAS about how tenants get involved in employment support. We run a TPAS Awards. We've run it for 14 years now. One of the categories we have is excellence in employment support, skills and training. Fantastic examples in there of where people are doing stuff. It's great to see Weaver Vale here today. They were one of our finalists this year, for example. But I still think we've got a long way to go, given how the world has changed. So I was set in that category, years ago. The world is moved on so much. I often talk about, why would you do good engagement? Why should we do it? And all the way I've talked the last 10 years, it's always about three principles. I think it's important just to come back to those for me. There's an absolute business case to do engagement, and the business case links to employment support here, doesn't it? If we can make sure that housing associations are well run, bringing the income in, et cetera, delivering services that people want, not over-serving, all that's a great business case. We've been sadly lacking kind of the policy reason to do engagement, the policy driver to do engagement. That's coming. So that's great. That's the second reason. But the third reason for me has always been about what engagement can do to bring forward tenants that want to into the engagement structure, build skills, build confidence, but get them opportunities to be engaged in a landlord that can go on to help them get involved in work in whichever way they want to. I think the last point I just want to land here, what I think the white paper is really clear about, and what the regulator's been clear about saying is, know your tenant's priorities. So when the regulator does come out to do inspections in time, they will be asking us all that, won't they? What are your tenant's priorities? And I think we've got to have the answer ready for that. And I think knowing where tenants' priorities around employment support, what they want, what they need, and quite locally what they want and need, we're going to be able to need to answer that. And the only way we'll be able to answer that is if we've been out and if we've talked to our tenants and our communities about that very, very issue quite specifically. So I think tenants' priorities, knowing those and how that feeds into employment support is going to be critical. And I'll stop there for now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jenny, for opening up the session. And I agree, as chair, actually, you raised some really interesting points about tenant priorities and how we understand them and feed that back and articulate that into our own services and provision. It's absolutely key. Okay, without further ado, I'd love to introduce Lynn Brosnan, tenant advisory panel member for the National Housing Federation, but with much experience. So Lynn's been involved with various tenant and resident associations for over 38 years. For the last 10 years, Lynn's been involved with Rochdale Borough-wide Housing in developing a tenant and employee-owned housing association based on cooperative values. 22 years ago, she was one of the founders of Turf Hill Estate Management Board, and that's where Lynn lives, and that's still going strong today. At that time, they turned a very unpopular estate and managed to secure 9.2 million improvement grant under estate action funding. So plenty of experience there in neighbourhoods and place. Lynn is chair of Rochdale Borough-wide Housing Representative Body and is also chair of the customer panel there. And she's also chair of their estate management board. So Lynn, you're clearly running the show at Rochdale, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to speak at this session today and share your perspective. Over to you, Lynn. Oh, Lynn, you're on mute. Can you just unmute yourself?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Over the years, we've seen, I think, many changes, but one of the things that hasn't really changed is the lack of quality employment within our communities. So I just wanted to say what we've done. What we noticed on the representative body, that there was very few, and in fact, at one point, there was only one tenant that had put themselves forward for the apprenticeship scheme. We kind of like said, well, it's really not good enough, that. So we ring-fence to tenants, which not only gives RBH the opportunity to create employment outcomes for tenants, but make sure more jobs go to people living in the borough, in our communities, which in turn contributes to the local economy. RBH sees itself as having a responsibility to the local economy in our role as an anchor organisation. RBH invests a lot of time and energy in our apprentices through their induction and the additional access to mentoring throughout their qualification. We believe this reaps rewards, with more than 85% of our apprentices moving into permanent contracts with us at the end of their qualification. Due to the high retention rate, apprentices provide us with a more sustainable workforce and contribute to our succession planning. This has proven particularly critical since the pandemic, which has become increasingly difficult to recruit. This is especially true of our trade apprenticeships and our repairs workforce. We have such great outcomes from the apprenticeship programme that we are exploring ways to expand this beyond the apprenticeship levy entitlement, which is already utilised beyond 100%. And we also work with other organisations. So those that are not successful in gaining an apprenticeship with RBH are pointed into other directions. I mean, I remember seeing a short film of one apprentice before he came to RBH, very despondent. And his attitude was, oh, you're not going to send me on another one of them blooming courses, are you? So no, they weren't going to send him on another course, but offer him an apprenticeship. And to see that young person's life change around is what it's all about. It's about real opportunities for tenants. Our apprenticeship scheme goes across the board, so it's not just tradesmen, it's the business side of it as well, the governance side of it, and all of those other things. So that has been something that has been driven from the representative body, and I am really, really proud of it, and I'm really, really proud that RBH took that on board. There is continuous support for our apprenticeships, and seeing them go forward, and that is the direct link between mutuality, tenants, employers. So we all have a stake in it, and often over the years that's not always been the case. We've seen, because it was ring fenced and it was advertised as being ring fenced, we had just an absolute influx of tenants applying. Before that, we didn't. So it just proves that by targeting and supporting and helping people, how successful we can be. And all our apprentices are paid the living wage as well, right the way throughout their traineeship.
Thanks,
so
Lynn.
Yeah, that's.
I was going to say, I missed you just at the start there. Did you say that an apprenticeship program came out of the representative body?
Yes, it did. Because when we looked back on, and you think one tenant applied for over a period of 3 years, that's just not good enough.
Right.
So the reasons were why we positively work forward. We've got a great team of people that encourage our young people and push them forward and what have you, and are there to help and support them. I just think over the years, like I said, I've been involved for 38 years in various things, and it's one of the most successful schemes, and the one that I'm really, really proud of. I'm proud of RBH for driving forward as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Apprenticeships are a great way of providing opportunities in a local area. And of course, as a housing provider, we can provide those jobs as well. Can I just ask as well, Lynn, are you getting any sort of feedback from the many tenant panels that you're on, and just what you hear in your neighbourhood for if social housing tenants in your area want employment support, and if they know that their landlords can provide that support? Is there any sense? What's your sense of that?
That is really advertised within our communities, and as we come out the pandemic, I think the pandemic has held a lot of things back because people can't get online. It's been really, really difficult. But as we move forward now, there's an encouragement to go out into the community, to use the community centres effectively, and sort of, I suppose, for want of a better word, drag people in kicking and screaming. RBH can help you.
Yeah. Okay, great. I'm sure we'll come to it in the conversation after we've heard from Steve, Lynn, but I'm very interested in how you do that. So thank you for talking about the apprenticeship work at Rochdale there. And is there anything more from you, Lynn, now? If not, I'll move on to Steve.
No, sorry, yes, that's fine.
Brilliant, okay. Thanks, Lynn. I'm going to move on to Steve and Ward, Social Housing White Paper Implementation Programme lead. I want to say lead at the end of that, Steve. I'm not sure if that's fair though. Who I've also worked with on the Housing and Employment Task Force that we run at Communities That Work, and in a range of other sort of networking opportunities. So it's really nice to see Steve here giving that government department view from DLUC. So just a quick background to Steve before I hand over to him. He joined DLUC in 2019 and is now delivering on the social housing white paper proposals. So his current role is a policy advisor, and he's leading on the professionalisation and antisocial behaviour work streams. So there's a lot there in the role of social housing, the workforce in social housing, and our approach and our professional standards in tenant engagement and in wider, in the management and business of running social housing. So there's a lot that Steve has to cover there. Although quite new to DLUC, Steve's worked in social housing throughout his career, wide experience in lots of different operational settings, so he knows housing well. And prior to joining DLUC, he worked at Northumberland County Council, and he led on and managed the council's participation in the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, which was providing housing and support for refugees fleeing the Syrian crisis. So really varied experience, and from the sharp end of some social housing. Steve, over to you. Good to hear from you.
Thanks very much, Lindsay. I'm always conscious when we get introduced that it's a big mouthful, the Social Housing White Paper Implementation Team. But basically, we sit within the overall Housing and Planning Directorate. And if you think about the white paper, each chapter effectively is a work stream which follows through each chapter of the white paper. And as Lindsay said, I'm looking at leading the white paper work on professionalisation and social behaviour. And I welcome the opportunity to talk to everybody this morning and share what we're doing to actually move forward the agenda with tenant engagement. And the speaker's note said, could I comment on how the dial has been turned? Well, I can certainly say that our ministers have certainly got their fingers on the dial and are certainly turning it to move it towards an opportunity for people to be listened to, not only by the landlords, but I think it's fair to say that we, as the people who are responsible for development policy, we want to hear what people want to say about us and what they think of social housing, because we can't be remote from the front line. We can't deliver. It's not our job. We don't do that. But we have to make sure that whatever we do is in context and it is travelling in the right direction. And it's good that Jenny's mentioned the policy driver. And I think that, without doubt, the policy driver for the work we're doing is that we recognise just how important it is for tenants' views, the tenant's voice, as it's now becoming the coinage in the sector, to be heard by landlords and by the government. And I'll just touch on a few examples quickly of what we've done within Dulux. And again, that's another mouthful, the Department of Levelling Up and Housing and communities, but it just shows you how big the scope of our work is. So basically, it's a big department with big ambitions, certainly driven by two very committed, interested ministers. So in terms of how do we engage and what we want to do, every work stream is encouraged to make sure we have a tenant's input into the work that we do. So if we look at the work of the Decent Homes Review, which concluded in October, we set up a sounding board, and it wasn't just full of technical experts who dealt with the building side of decency and housing safety. They had tenants on there who could input some real practical experience of what it's like living in social housing and feeding in issues around repairs and disrepair. Within the white paper work itself, we've established an expert challenge panel, which is, I know, familiar certainly to Lindsay. And the idea of that is just to act as a critical friend and a scrutineer of the work of what we're doing within the white paper. And again, that's something where tenants are clearly involved. We have tenants sitting on it to input their view. The Building Safety Advisory Board, which flowed from the work that arose out of the tragedy of Grenfell. Again, that was much driven by the work of our tenants. And in my own view, my own area, professionalisation, we have two tenants groups who are helping us on shape our thinking and policy direction. We have people from Jenny's organisation, one of her colleagues sits on our working group. And we also have representatives from Grenfell United who really, you know, are invaluable in terms of sharing their experience of how they felt they've been treated and what sort of they would like to see in terms of professional standards from our housing staff. Going forward, one of the things that we have mentioned in the white paper and we will be taking forward is what we've called the Resident Opportunities and Empowerment Fund. And that's, I haven't much detail on that because it's still being developed, but in effect, it's an opportunity to provide funding to develop the skills and training for tenants. So they have two things, the toolkit to actually challenge their landlord, but also instill in them the confidence to do so, because we recognise that sometimes trust is a big part of it, but there is a difference between people's perception of seeing their landlord as remote and the landlord who is genuinely they can approach. So as that programme develops on what the content of that is, we'll be sharing that from the department's point of view. The ministers are very keen to do engagement, so both from the Secretary of State and from our Minister Eddie. In fact, this week I've been working on a couple of potential visits for Eddie to get out and speak to tenants on across the country. I know Jenny mentioned the regulator, and again, the white paper is taking some big steps in trying to create a more proactive consumer regulation. One of the big things is removing the serious detriment test, which means it's easier, or should be easier rather, for the regulator to get involved where things have gone wrong, and the bar for doing that certainly won't be as high. But I guess the important thing is the change to the introduction of tenant satisfaction measures. There's quite a lot, and I won't name them all, but there's 22. But the important thing for me, of the 22 being consulted on currently, is that 12 are based on tenant perceptions. So it just goes to show basically more than half are about what do people think and what are people's understanding, can we hear about their experiences, particularly in relation to the respectful and helpful engagement theme the regulator is looking at. The questions are around how satisfied tenants are with their landlord who listens to their views and acts upon them, how satisfied landlords are being, or how satisfied tenants are with their landlords keeping them informed of not what the landlord thinks is a good idea, but what tenants actually want to be informed about, which is again a subtle difference. And the last one, of course, which is relevant in terms of tenants' voice, is the level of agreement over which landlords and customers agree they're being treated with fairness and respect. For me, though, a key indicator of how the dial is being turned is in the language that we use in the department, and certainly coming through with the tenant satisfaction measures. When I first started in housing, the issue was around listening to tenants and taking account of. But I think to me, there's two words now in the fabric of what we do make the difference, and that's act upon. And I think that's a big cultural change that we see coming forward. To see change, we're not just asking landlords to take account of people's views, we're asking landlords to actually act upon them, i.e. listen and react and do something. This is also echoed in the work of the Housing Ombudsman Service. We've took steps to strengthen that already, so that the landlords, the Ombudsman rather, can go beyond just single cases. In the past, they've dealt with individual complaints and made judgments and issued those. But in October, they issued their first thematic report, which is on damp and mould, which is a good step forward for them. The building safety bill has changed. So going forward, there's no need now for people to find a designated person before they approach the Ombudsman, or have to wait 8 weeks for doing so. And within my own area, which is something I'm very passionate about, our work to raise professional standards, a key theme there is looking at what skills, not just qualifications, but what skills and what behaviours do staff need to be able to communicate effectively for their tenants, treat them with respect, with courtesy, so that they are perceived and they feel that they really are being treated with empathy by the people delivering the service. And again, the key thing is that we'll be driving the review forward so that we work on that with the landlords. I am certainly looking forward to working with our tenants groups and getting out on the road and hearing the experiences of people like Lynn from across the country who can help us shape that direction of travel. So I hope that was a useful run through of what's in the white paper. It's a big old thing and not quite as big as the Levelling Up white paper, but it's certainly in terms of social housing, I think a landmark change. And we are definitely within the department have the backing of the ministers to make sure that it does make a difference. So at that point, I'll pass back to Lindsey.
Thanks, Steve. And just before you go on mute, I was just interested, and I wanted to capture the correct name of the. I think you mentioned a program which is coming, not yet, but a resident. Was it Resident Participation Fund or resident something?
Yeah, it's another one of our long words. It's. You got me thinking there. Right, it's the Resident Opportunities and Empowerment Fund.
Resident Opportunities and Empowerment Fund. Yeah,
so it will contain proposals to work with tenants to equip and skill them up and build their confidence so that they're able to address issues they come across with their landlords.
Okay, thank you. That's much appreciated. And I ask in particular, obviously we're interested to know that, but one of the comments and questions we've had that I can see in the chat box so far, and I'm happy to get any thoughts from Lynn, Jenny, or Steve, if you've any more to say, is around. It's a question on your views on national training programs or support for tenants, so that their representation is fair and delivered sort of properly. So the question is, how do we ensure that tenants' voice is heard correctly? Which I think means, how do you empower tenants and residents to engage fairly across the opportunity of engagement, and confidently and with skills, and to impart their experience, rather than perhaps doing a tick box exercise or paying lip service to tenant engagement. So is there a training angle there, or is there another support angle there to encourage tenants and residents to engage in the opportunity which is coming towards them from their landlords and from the social housing sector? So Steve, any quick further comments from you, although I respect the fact you can't give details on the fund you just mentioned, and then I'll come to Lynn and then Jenny on that question.
Yeah, no further comments from me, and I wish I could, because I'd love to be able to say, "Oh, we're going to do this, and this," but I can't, so unfortunately. But if I could just comment on the point you've just made, Lindsay, to me, the key thing is organisational culture. That's critical in all of this. Money would only take you so far, but if there's not the mindset and there's not the drive from the people at the top of organisations, in fact, right the way through the organisations, that's certainly something we're finding with our work on professional standards. We can design any framework we think is going to develop and deliver that, but if the organisation itself is not truly committed to taking it on board, it probably hasn't got a great deal of success. So my comment would be, it's for landlords and housing providers to really get behind the whole concept of what we're talking about today, and make sure it is embedded into the philosophy of what they're doing. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Steve, very much, and thanks for your opening comments as well. Lynn, can I go to you, please? What thoughts do you have about empowering and supporting tenants and residents to get involved?
Yeah, I think we're going to launch a fun day, basically, and as we come out the pandemic.
Yeah,
there's going to be stuff for the kids to do. There's going to be all sorts of things, but what's going to happen is that we're going to walk amongst people, talking to them. So instead of it being in one big hall with somebody talking to you, and people don't always take that in, and when you notice you call the second meeting, they don't come, or a lot of them, a high percentage, don't come. I think it's the language that's used. Lots of new language come on board. I'm used to it, but I just think it's very corporate-y. When I go and have a brew with my friends or what have you, or I go to the community centre, we don't talk in that language. So I think it's often a corporate language barrier. But I think as well, it's not about somebody standing talking to somebody. It's about involving people. It's about giving them the opportunities. One of the things that I thought worked really well when the ministers went around the country, where they spoke at the front, I think there were 3 or 4 I heard over the time, but they spoke at the front for some time, and then it was a round table. So people started discussing things, and civil servants and the minister went round. I remember we had Kit Malthouse on ours, and after a while, one of the civil servants said, "Kit, you have to move on." But we're having a really good conversation with him. And he wasn't this, "Oh my God, that's a minister." He was just a person that was listening to us and writing down loads of notes. So I think it's those type of things. I think it's behaviours from both sides. And it's about, you've got to remember, from our side, we're not very trustworthy. We don't trust very much, because we've had, and I think it was Jenny who just mentioned about sending out surveys. Loads of surveys. Nothing comes of surveys. You don't hear back from surveys. So what is the point of sending out surveys? And that was one of the things that we discussed not so long ago at RBH. It's about getting back to people. If those people have filled in that survey, if you get back to that person so that they know that you've listened to them, you can drag them in, once again, kicking and screaming, invite them to a meeting with a relaxed atmosphere. And I think that's what drives it forward. I got involved because years ago, 38, maybe it's longer, I stopped counting at 38 because people might guess my age. And it was because our estate was so run down and because we were plastered all over the local newspaper and we'd had enough. So we got them all in, police, the lot, and we shouted at them, your attitude and behaviour towards us is not acceptable. But, you know, and there was a big brick wall, but slowly that brick wall started to come down because they started to show us that attention. They helped us during the estate action time, helped and supported us for the estate to be safe, for it, you know, for it to respect families so that children could play out in the back gardens. It's as simple as that, really. And then, you know, and there's not just me, there's quite a few of us from Rochdale that have been involved all of those years. But it's continuously encouraging people to take over from us because we're getting old now, you know, and we need that voice, you know, that younger drive coming in. Yeah. I got an award not so long ago, you know, from RBH. One of our people that used to work for RBH went on Twitter and he said, I remember a very, very angry from years ago. So, and I think that's what you know, people usually get involved for, but I think it's the approach, you know. And like I said, our fun day after the pandemic, because people drop off after the pandemic and they think getting motivated is hard, so that's why we're going to have a fun day.
That sounds good, Lynn. Thank you. And you know, you speak so passionately about the work you've done. It really does rub off. And the stuff you talked about with apprenticeships, it also is reflected in a comment from one of our guests here at this session, talking about bringing more customers, social housing tenants and residents into the jobs which we supply locally, and maybe that will rebalance that relationship and create a better relationship between landlord and tenant. But thank you, Lynn. You also mentioned some of those roadshows where ministers were going around, and that leads me, I was going to ask Jenny, who I know mentioned those as well, but Jenny, just going back to your perspective on that original question about, you know, supporting tenants and residents and how best to engage and make that a genuine two-way street and not get stuck behind corporate language barriers, etc., etc. Any reflections from your experience, Jenny?
Yeah, I mean, I've reflected some of this back to the department already around kind of this. I think it's a really interesting kind of fund and pot of money or whatever you want to call it, because I think training, yes, and I'll come to that in a second, but, you know, I do think there's a huge amount of work still to do about awareness. So, you know, if we go back to the roundtables, we go back to the conversations at Grenfell, you know, I remember saying to people, survivors, saying, well, why didn't you just report it? Why didn't you go to the Ombudsman? And nobody knew they existed. Now, I know we've come way past that now. We're much further forward. But there is still something needed in this country so that tenants, even before they get involved with their landlord, have got somewhere they can go to and trust to say, this is what your rights are. You know, I'm not afraid of saying the word rights. Rights, roles, responsibilities. People have tenancy agreements. Do they understand what that means? Do they understand who are the people in the sector they can go to if they've got a problem in this area or that area? Do they understand, you know, how a housing association might function or the other organisations? So there's definitely something about awareness, which is empowerment in itself, isn't it? And then you take it forward to actually what are the skills people might need, or are there some generic ones that might to get involved with their landlord? But that's only going to be useful if the landlord is going to allow those engagement opportunities to come to the surface. Now, some of that they'll be forced to because of the regulation. But I think Steve's point is absolutely right. We can train as much as we want, as much as we want. But we've got to have the culture in an organisation that says, I'm not just doing this as a tick box. Yes. I think we're going to want to do something really special here. So maybe the question we should be asking ourselves is not, do we need a resident opportunities fund for training? Do we need a staff one? Because actually tenants are tenants, and tenants will do what they want to do and will give their opinions and voices and experience in whichever way. And that's absolutely right. How that's then, as Stephen said, listened, reacted to, and something done with it, maybe that's the training we need to be thinking far more about if we're going to really change culture in our organisations. I just land that as kind of something to think about. Yeah. Because I do, you know, landlords have a fundamental responsibility in this, even with a national programme, and I'm fully supportive of that. I do think we need a national programme. If landlords truly believe in tenant engagement, they'll have got the business case for it as well as the regulatory reason. And that they'll say, it's well worth me investing in some training if I want people to help me to redesign my services, if I want tenants to do some co-creation work with me, if I need to then invest a little bit of money to save, well, then that's good business sense. So I just think we need to also keep thinking the bigger picture here, that just sending tenants on some courses around chairing skills is not going to be the answer to what we're looking here.
Got it. Thank you. A powerful point made there, Jenny. Steve, can I ask you if you've got any particular comments on that? I'm thinking about the staff fund, which Jenny just mentioned, and also how that links to the professionalisation work that you are doing, Steve. So if you have any particular comments there, and then I'll ask for any closing words from any of our panelists. So Steve, just back to you first, please.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think I was going to make the same point that Jenny did, really. It's about, it's turning all the rhetoric into action. And it's actually making sure that, people get the principle, people understand what's required of them, and the regulator will set that out of what landlords are expected and required to do. And we're still having much the world of light touch regulation to make sure that landlords are free to respond at the operational level, given the conditions they're facing and the resources they've got. So it's very much all about making sure that people can actually trust their landlord, that if they take the trouble and put themselves out and get involved in it, that their views are going to be taken into account. And I think from my point of view, from the professionalisation work that we're doing, what we'd like to be able to think going forward is that when one of the themes in the review is that we want to see staff equipped to be able to support more vulnerable tenants. And that's those who are suffering from mental health, be it or related to a drug issue or whatever. But the principles of recognising when somebody's in distress and somebody needs help and pointing them in the right direction can apply to any service. And certainly, families, some associations have detail of staff are working with the family support unit, finding opportunities to actually identify your customers who need help, who might be able to benefit from encouragement, is going to be critical. And it's for everybody involved in the association and the local authority to be able to identify that and feed it back to the right people in the centre so it can be actioned.
Thank you, Steve. And just a very last quick question before I sum up. There is a specific question for you, Steve, really. When will the Resident Opportunity and Empowerment Fund go live, please? Is there any time scale for that? Is it this year or?
I cannot comment because I genuinely don't know the answer.
There you go. Well, that's an answer. So thank you for giving us your honest answer. We'll of course look out for it, and glad to see it coming on board. We'll see how it really rolls through into action. Okay, any closing comments or thoughts from any of our panelists, from Lynn, Jenny or Steve indeed? Jenny.
Sorry to come in on that point around kind of, how this links to getting tenants involved, becoming people that we employ in our organisations, and how our support services work towards that. I think that's really, really critical. I think it's about the, feeds to the levelling up agenda, it feeds to everything, and I think it feeds to stigma, because there is a danger, isn't there, I think, if we talk too much about we need to do employment initiatives for our tenants, it feeds into that real problem around stigma that tenants all need our help, which just isn't true. Well, I think if we're going out and saying, actually, what we're trying to do is employ people in this fantastic sector that we have got, that there is a good sector to be part of. You can make a difference. Let's get local people involved in the companies that deliver local services. I really don't think we've quite cracked that nut yet, and I think that's crucial if we're going to drive out a bit more stigma in our sector in the future as well. Much more sustainable if we can achieve that.
Agreed. Yeah, thank you, Jenny. And perhaps goes back to one of Lynn's first points about the apprenticeship programme and driving that local opportunity for local tenants and residents who, for whatever reason, may not have felt it was an opportunity for them, but now they're in the business and changing the business's culture just by being there. So I agree totally. And I don't think the numbers of tenants and residents in the sector are strong enough. And if you looked at another sector like health, it would be, you know, as weird as thinking that everyone who works in health never uses a health service, you know, it'd be as odd as that. So we really need to move on and get more tenants and residents engaged in our own sector, and also our procurement chains, our supply chains, etc. Okay, I'm aware of time. There's been some really good conversations actually between our delegates in the chat box, sort of sharing information and offering information as well. So thank you for engaging in that, everyone. And I would say if you've made an offer to share info or share a contact, either do it in the chat box now, or send an email to the conference organisers, to Helena or to me, and we'll make sure that information gets shared through. But if there's an email contact or anything like that you're chatting to someone in the chat box now, please just share it briefly, and we can capture that and make sure we can refer that on if you want to share your contact details with someone you're chatting to in this session, as you've heard from our speakers. So just wanted to cover that. I think we're almost at the close, really. So as Helena, who's helping me in the background here, has said, we'll have a little break, and then there's a final session with everyone back in the same virtual room to hear a closing keynote. So just before we get there, I wanted to say a big thanks to Lynn Brosnan for speaking, for Jenny Osborne, and to Steve Ward. 3 really different perspectives, but all of them expert. And I've really enjoyed just listening to you and thinking about some of my own work, and also hearing from our delegates who are engaging in what you've been saying as well. So there's plenty of opportunity going forwards, right? And it feels like this year might be one of those years where we do get some new opportunities to change that relationship permanently. As Jenny said, no, not so much for the flavour of the month, but really change that relationship for the good and for the long term. So I'll have my fingers crossed on that, and I'll be doing what I can to make that work. And huge thanks to you for joining us, and for our speakers for all coming in and speaking so clearly and eloquently today. If you've time, grab a coffee, and if you've time, you're very welcome, of course, to come back for our final keynote, everyone here, including our speakers. So thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your contact details, our delegates, and have a lovely afternoon. We're in it. It's 12:03, so take care, everybody.